So today we have Bob Hanson, who is our Northwest Sands, Sharp-tailed Grouse, and Burnett County Wildlife Biologist for the Department of Natural Resources. He works on state, county, federal, private, and industrial lands to try to promote the Northwest Sands ecological landscape along with doing other county wildlife biologist work. We also have Brian Heeringa, who is a U.S. Forest Service wildlife biologist for the Washburn District. Brian works on federal lands within the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. Both have been very involved in Northwest Sands ecosystem restoration and sharp-tailed grouse relocation. So with that, and without giving too much away, I will let Bob and Brian go into discussing the history of the Wisconsin Northwest Barrens and their effort to restore this very special and important ecosystem. Thank you all for joining, and thanks Bob and Brian for participating.
Yeah, thanks for putting us on. Brian, you want to say anything right away, or should I just start in?
Go for it, Bob.
Okay. Well, first I'll go and kind of get into my presentation, and then mine will be a little kind of a broad overview of what we're doing, and look at a whole bunch of different ways we're doing habitat work, doing different partnerships. And Brian's going to drill down and talk about more how we do it on a particular spot, mainly the Moquah Barrens up where he's working. All right, so once again, I'm a Northwest Sands wildlife biologist. Been working on this for I think 6 or 7 years now, trying to remember correctly. But we have a bunch of different partnerships up here, and really it's all about the partnerships to connect the landscape. You would not want to try to do this alone, or even just one entity trying to pull it off. It's a huge landscape. It's about 1.2 million acres in size. We have all these really cool wildlife areas scattered amongst this landscape that has cool things going on for wildlife. A lot of barrens communities within there, and a lot of nice wetlands as well. But really the whole landscape is still barrens, just it's in a different state than maybe what it started with pre-settlement times. But it's all about the sand here. It's some places the sand is hundreds of feet deep. That creates really dry conditions at times. And if you pull up a map of all the historic fires in our neck of the woods up here in the northwest part of the state, the historic fires themselves kind of map out where the Northwest Sands is, just kind of by the frequency of occurrence, just even what we know from our brief snapshot of time as humans here, and be able to record what we find. I'll point out one fire in particular. Move my cursor here. This is a German Road fire, kind of in the middle part of the screen, that burned in 2013, about 7,400 acres in size. And this over here is a 5-mile fire from 1977, about 14,000 acres in size. It's kind of give you a reference to the size of some of this, and we're talking about pretty big disturbance and fairly high fire return history, especially in pre-settlement times before we kind of slowed the fires down. So what happens if you have this kind of this cool sand system that has fire-dependent species on it, jack pine, oak, aspen trees, then underneath you have this kind of cool barrens ground layer. It's got a lot of prairie stuff in it. Hoary Puccoon is the flower pictured there. A lot of little blue stem and big blue stem. Then you also have these acid-loving soils, ericaceous shrubs that love the acid-loving soils, and stuff like blueberries. So a lot of blueberries and a lot of other cool shrubs that kind of go into this whole mix. And with that habitat, then you kind of get these kind of nice, some rare species of wildlife like upland sandpiper and sharp-tailed grouse. But then you also get more common, species, red fox and eastern towhee out there, always trying to tell you to drink your tea whenever you're out in the barrens in the spring. So looking at where our priorities lie and where we have opportunities, looking at barrens is obviously an important thing. If you want to manage for barrens anywhere in the world, this is the best spot to do it. So we hold that as a high importance as far as the priorities. And in this plan, they named it globally important just because of that rare occurrence, and where in the world would you do this? You would do it here. So recognize barrens is important. We also recognize, though, if you don't manage barrens, that eventually the trees will grow up and close in the barrens, and those first trees will tip over, and you'll lose your oak, and maybe you'll go to a maple forest or something like that. So we know we have concern there. We need to manage this landscape. So another thing we looked at is those kind of cool wildlife areas we had scattered across the Northwest Sands. Is we started looking at those, and those kind of yellow dots up in the upper left hand side there. But we noticed that those properties are a little bit of a distance apart. Looking at sharp-tailed grouse genetics, we found that there's very little gene flow going back and forth between the properties, or none at all really. And that those species were actually genetically isolated and no longer exchanging between the properties. So we started looking at like, well, okay, so if the wildlife isn't moving between the Barrens properties, how could we do that? And he started looking at this idea of having a habitat corridor plan. And one thing I like to point out with the green arrows there is one thing I like to tell people, just a really simplified version of what I do is I tell them I'm the green arrows guy. So it's a good way to explain simply what I do for work. And so the habitat plan really looked at, what is between these properties and where do we have opportunity? And it's all pine barrens, just it's in a different state. It's a little bit more mature. And also it's fairly straightforward as far as the distance between being a straight shot. So it's a low cost of movement, so you can go in a fairly straight line. And they took that idea and said, well, okay, these are area sensitive species. You need bigger blocks of habitat. How would you, get that movement between properties? So what they figured out is if you could take a block of habitat about 12,000 or 1,280 acres in size, so 2 sections, and then have those habitat patches within 3 miles or 3.1 miles, then you should be able to get movement between the properties. And it's kind of a stepping stone style corridor, not like a narrow hallway or something like that type corridor, but more of a stepping stone style. So looking at the Northwest Sands, I kind of give you a tour of some of the properties and some of the unique partnerships we have going on, and kind of show how we're starting to get something done on this. Down here in the bottom, you have Creeks Meadows, but you see a lot of this light green is county forest, Burnett County Forest, and up here you have Washburn County, or Douglas County Forest, sorry. And over here you have Bayfield County Forest, and a little bit down here in Washburn as well. And then this purple looking stuff, this is the Brew St. Croix Legacy Forest, currently owned by Hancock Forest Management, and that's under DNR easement. And then we also have this green up here on the top is Brew River State Forest, and then over up here by Moquah Barrens, and the kind of the brown tan color, that's the Chequamegon National Forest. So lots of public land and lots of opportunities for partnerships. So taking off from Creeks Meadows and taking a look at what that looks like. It's obviously a big state-owned wildlife area. There's lots of wetlands, lots of barrens, and it's really just a big jigsaw puzzle of burn units. Pushing 30,000 acres actually. So that's your typical burn unit and wildlife management area, managed for wildlife with sharp-tailed grouse and many other species in consideration, including waterfowl. And you go north from Creeks, you get into some of this Burnett County Forest, and we do have some projects going with Burnett County Forest around Namaquogan Barrens and up in that country, and another little fire break up there called Deer Lake Fuel Break. But you also see this other stuff just north of the county line and into Douglas County, and that's our next stop. Oops, wrong way. So up in Douglas County, then they're doing some harvesting in an area where we find that once you do the harvest in this area, that the barrens comes right back again. And this is harvest, and they're also kind of trying to regenerate jack pine, so that it's going to be forested again. But in the meantime, it's really good barrens for about 12 years. We get really nice open barrens conditions. And what we're finding is if we can take that habitat where we started up here in number 1, this is about a 5,400 acre project, and start doing cutting, going from 1 to 2 to 3 and so forth, is we can open it up and get that over a section in size already, and now we're heading for 2 sections to get that species requirement as far as size goes, and we can keep working our way through that. This is called the 5 Mile Barrens because it's part of that 5 Mile fire that happened in 1977. And this red area checkered is part of that old fire, and it's all natural regen from that fire, and it's actually a state natural area as well. And we're working with our state natural area folks in the management of that, and included with this kind of a silviculture barrens or barrens through silviculture, where we're able to move across this property with this barrens project. And it's going to take about 50 years to get from where we start to the number 9 there. But that's another way of doing barrens without actually having burn units. So that was up in this country here off of Highway T and the tan stuff. And you see the green here is Namakagon Barrens. So it's within that 3 miles, perfect spot for a stepping stone. But you see another opportunity down here, kind of that lime green area, but the purple stuff. And what that is that's that private industrial forest, part of the legacy forest, and under DNR easement. And working with them, we've come up with a plan to take their part of that 5 mile fire, 5,000 acres of it, and cut it over time, going from north to south, and in a way that provides that big opening again. So they have about 900 acres cut, and we'll continue on with that. And just to point out too, the gold diamonds, that is the sharp-tailed grouse historic lek sites that are there. So I like having that on there. Kind of shows like, hey, it's worked before. Hopefully, it can work again. So we went out with Paul Helena, a botanist, and checked some of these sites, and we found that we actually have really good species coming back right after the loggers are done. And we went out on some of these sites. We're pushing 100 different plant species, almost all of them native. And we actually assigned it a botany value as far as quality goes. And we found that we're getting really nice quality habitat coming back. So that makes us happy. And there's a couple of interns pictured there. So somebody might recognize a couple of those folks. But the guy in the coveralls is Paul Helena. He's our botanist helping us out. So another project, you go further north, this is the Douglas County Wildlife Area. Historic, been there a long time, lots of bird trialing going on, bird dog trialing going on. And it's also known as the bird sanctuary. But anyways, it's kind of a neat wildlife area in that it's about 1,000 acres of state-owned land, and then about a little over 3,000 acres of leased land that we lease from the county and been going on for decades. So that's kind of a unique hybrid of a wildlife area where we are managing it through fire and burn units, but it's a part of it's actually leased, or a good part of it's actually leased. Coming off the Douglas County Wildlife Area, we move into this other part of the, this is that easement lands again, but that German Road fire that hit in 2013 hit a big chunk there, 7,400 acres, but it actually provided essentially 2 stepping stones to help us get further up the corridor. And the day of the fire, there wasn't a single sharp-tailed grouse lek within the footprint of it. But now there's currently a lek right about in here, one up in here, one here, and one off 27 here too. So it did provide the habitat, is doing what it's supposed to do. It's unfortunate that it was, a lot of private property was lost and some homes and stuff too. But it is interesting to see the habitat responding the way it's supposed to, and then the birds responding the way they're supposed to too. This is a snapshot Wisconsin picture of one of the leks. You see the sharp-tails dancing. You can see the jack pine coming back in the background there. And you also see that it was mowed. The owner is willing to let us come in and mow the lek, so hopefully maintain them for a little bit longer into the future as this forest regenerates. So north from German Road then is this area of the Brewer State Forest called Mott's Ravine. And Mott's Ravine is a little bit small in size, but we have enough forest around it to continue working through harvest and increasing the Barrens size as far as the burn units, but then also through harvest to increase the scale of the unit itself. And to the north is Cedar Island, that's a Nature Conservancy easement. And to the south is more of that Brewer River legacy forest, the easement lands. They're willing to work with us too into the future as far as providing a bigger block of Barrens habitat. Here's a shot of Mott's Ravine shortly after a prescribed burn, where we've been able to increase the size of it, working with the state forest, and hopefully continue on with that as far as the cutting going around this property. And if you see, because you look to the north, you see a block of forest. Then further north, further to the top of the screen, you can see kind of a pale, ghostly looking thing. Well, that's actually that German Road fire from 2013. So it kind of gives you a landscape scale as far as how these stepping stones have to lie out, and how far the birds are willing to move to set up new habitat. So coming off of Mott's Ravine up here, then we can go to the across the county line into Bayfield County, and the Bayfield County Forest has the Barrens Barrens. And the interesting thing about that is historically there was a fuel break that went through. Is about 1,000 acres in size. They're currently restructuring that into 1,000 acres square block. That'll be the core area. So that'll be maintained much like a wildlife area where you prescribe burn and maintain it in the open state. And then in the 4 blocks surrounding that core area, they're setting it up so that it can be harvested in every 12 years or so, and that's about 11,000 acres, and those blocks are all between 2,500 to 3,000 acres. So what we'll get for an effect then at some point in time, we start getting into that. You saw that that plan harvesting stretched out to the year 2082, so long-term strategic thinking on this. But as we do a harvest of 2,500 acres or so, that'll add on to that 1,000-acre core. We'll have 3,500 acres available for species that need that early type habitat. Then over time, as we continue on and cut the next unit, next unit, next unit every 12 years, we're going to provide different cereal stages for those type of critters that need that age class. And Kirkland's warbler is currently up in this neck of the woods, and actually in the German road fire area too. So that's the one that needs that younger stands probably after the sharp-tailed grouse are done using them, and it can move on. And interesting too, I got whippoorwills down here on the bottom for the more mature stuff, but turkeys, I love that stuff on the edge of with the more open barrens on the side too. So a lot of good game species as well. So going north from the Barrens Barrens, we have a new project called the Bass Lake Barrens. This is also county forest. We looked at where the birds were, and we saw that Moquah Barrens up here, when he did translocation there, that the birds started moving around and actually came to this private land lek. It's right out here in the kind of in the clay plain off the sands actually. And we realized that within this corridor plan, if you wanted to put a project right here, that would fit that corridor plan as far as providing connectivity on the landscape. So the county decided to go ahead and do that and create that new Barrens project, about 1,300 acres in size. And you can see it's about 46% upland and about 54% lowland. So it's going to be, I think, sort of like a little miniature cracks, to where there's the Barrens and the open wetlands working together, and sharp-tails use them hopefully. And I think other species, I think American bittern is going to do well here, and some other species like that, like the more wet stuff with the openness as well. So now we go up a little bit more. We hit that private land area up to the north. Then we get to the Chequamegon and Moquah Barrens, which is Brian's at. So that's good. Then moving on from the county forest projects onto the federal side of things. And as we do this work, not only are we working lots of different private or different land owners as far as the ownership goes, we also the friends of like the wildlife areas, Friends of Cracks Bird Sanctuary, and Friends of Namaquagan Barrens. They all realize that their barrens are isolated, and they want to see this connectivity because it'll benefit them as well. So they kind of come together along with the Wisconsin Sharp-tailed Grouse Society, and we kind of have the Friends of the Northwest Sands. It's a group that comes together, helps make brochures and publications, and currently working on a wildlife area. On an auto tour of the whole Northwest Sands, but as a way to promote what we're doing and let people know that we're doing all this stuff for a pretty darn good reason. So this is really a working group that comes together for projects, and we thank them for their help and support, and another great partnership. And with that, I think I can stop and I can let Brian take over.
Thanks, Bob. All right, that was a great overview of, I gotta wait till Bob stops sharing here. Okay, there we go.
Got it.
While we're transitioning, I'll just remind people, if they have questions for Bob or Brian, feel free to put those in the chat at any time, and we'll try to get to as many as we can after the presentations.
Great. Is my screen up?
Yes, you are good to go.
Perfect. Thanks. Well, thanks, Bob. That was a great overview of the whole Northwest Sands ecological landscape and what's going on across boundaries. And even though I'm going to focus on a little bit of the federal, the Chequamegon-Nicolet's management of the Moquah Barrens, a lot of what we do here extends across boundaries, and that's what really, managing, like Bob said, a landscape this large and trying to restore it takes a lot of teamwork, and hopefully that comes through in this presentation. And the slide that Bob just ended on is the one that I'm sharing here. And as he worked his way to the northeast, here we're talking about the Moquah Barrens, circled there in the blue. And this is one of the largest pieces of Barrens habitat in this part of the state. under the management of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. And I just want to give you a little bit of management history to give you a feel of what's gone on there and how that's led to where we are today. So the early history of the different influences that have affected this landscape. As many of you know, Native American influence was quite large. Typically, individuals would start human started fires to help restore, regenerate vegetation, particularly those that were used for food, such as blueberries or medicines. Also would be used for restoring and reducing brush for settlements and things like that. This was followed by European era logging and settlement. There was a large cutover period, late 1800s, early 1900s, that greatly influenced our state as a whole, but particularly this area expanding large open areas. This was followed by farming, civilian conservation corps era pine plantations, and of course, what led to some of the reforestation after the great cutover and many of the large fires that ran through the area was the fire exclusion. And through that, forests came back and Barrens habitat started to diminish. In the 1950s, a memorandum of understanding was established between the Forest Service and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources that diverted our focus towards sharp-tailed grouse management with reserving what remained of these large open areas. So there definitely was an understanding that these habitats were important, and the sharp-tailed grouse was a species of that focus. During the 1950s, a variety of restoration treatments occurred to maintain the open areas as they were and expand on those open areas little by little. This involved timber clear cuts, prescribed burning, mowing, tilling, herbicide spraying, and many other activities out there. In 1953, the Moquah Barrens was officially designated a wildlife management area. And this original boundary of the Moquah Barrens, you can see in the purple highlight there, just to give you an idea of where it falls within the Washburn Ranger District. The little map on the inset map on the left, within the red boxes is again the map that's on the right here. And so that purple boundary was about 8,000-ish acres of area designated as the wildlife management area, with that focus of larger open areas with that sharp-tailed grouse emphasis. In 1965, a supplement to that MOU came out that again focused on sharp-tailed grouse, but as you can see on the slide here, it added language for management of other wildlife species and resource values in accordance with multiple use objectives, which is really at the core of how the Forest Service approaches managing our lands for multiple uses that include, timber harvesting, recreation, hydrology, wildlife, fisheries, and so on. So that brought that aspect into the MOU for the Moquah Barrens. And I just also want to note that a portion of the Moquah Barrens is designated as a research natural area. And in 1970, that area became a state natural area. And then in 1980, that area was classified as a national natural landmark. So a lot of unique things have happened in the Barrens over the years, and one of which for the Chequamegon-Nicolet was the first prescribed burn on our national forest occurred within the Moquah Barrens on August 8th of 1963. So there is a fairly long history of fire being used as a management tool within the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, as well as outside national forest boundaries. But within the Moquah Barrens itself, a 1979 management plan came about with that primary objective of focusing on a vegetative environment that was typical of the area prior to fire control. So looking at the fire's influence on the landscape and using that as a disturbance mechanism to bring back, a more natural disturbance regime, and also those vegetative structural components, species, and also the wildlife that rely on a fire adapted ecosystem. And so that looked at timber harvesting as a way to do that, but also prescribed burning, looking at this had more of a focus on primarily spring burning, but then also they started out burning annually, but then with a focus of moving the return intervals to every 3 to 5 years. And throughout that management, they attempted to produce these open areas, as you can see in this photo, with scattered individual trees, clumps, and woodland groves that mimic that open barrens and savanna kind of habitat. And in this photo there, and if you were to come to the Washburn district and drive up Forest Road 236, you'd enter one of these areas like this that really showed that successful restoration of this habitat. However, as Bob can probably attest, when you start to do this management, you can also have areas that are difficult to open up, and you get these dense stands of oak, aspen, and maple saplings like in this photo, which can present some difficulty, but then, you know, these are actually important components of the landscape as well. So it's not about removing all of these parts, it's about, you know, being strategic about where that goes and actually letting nature kind of influence on its own where these happen and having a mosaic of habitats out on the landscape. In 2004, the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, you know, our current forest plan that we're operating under expanded that Moquah Barren. So if you can think back to that photo or that slide that had the original core boundary in purple, that added about 6,000 more acres to that core area and focused on maintaining it in a mostly open early successional barrens condition. Thinking back to that 1979 Barrens plan and into the 90s, if you remember that about the return interval 3 to 5 years, here our forest plan looked at lengthening those burnt intervals to more historic period of 8 to 12 years, and then allowing fields and topography to determine the intensity of fire in alternating seasons of burning rather than just focusing on spring. We also were looking at growing season burns or early dormant season burns. And then rather than just open grasslands, as I said, there's a mosaic of habitats that comprise this ecosystem. We're looking at that diversity of structure and species composition. And currently today, if you were to go out in the Moquah Barrens, you would find these 5 generalized habitat groupings are what you would find out there. You'd find areas of open barrens where you have less than 1 tree per acre. You'll have the savanna in the upper right that has 1 to 40 trees per acre generally over the landscape. Lower right hand corner there, you have the woodland, which is over 40 trees per acre, and of course closed forest is more than that. And then within that mosaic of habitats, you have these stands of small or dense small trees which benefit species if they're in jack pine, like this photo here, like the Kirtland's warbler. And so in 2009, our Northwest Sands Restoration Project was initiated, and this added even more acres to our Barrens management, bringing it up to about over 22,000 acres of habitat that we're managing in a variety of habitats, and including satellite barrens, areas that were removed from the core. And some of the actions that we utilize to work with our restoration are timber harvest, where we're favoring conifers over deciduous species. With the Northwest Sands Project, about 6,000 acres or over 6,000 acres have been harvested, or actually we're just approaching the last few of our timber sales in the area in this respect. Prescribed fire is our primary disturbance mechanism. As far as you can see here, multiple prescribed burns over nearly 16,000 acres that we're managing with fire to promote barrens vegetation, reducing those competing shrub covers, and improving the overall wildlife habitat for species such as sharp-tailed grouse, wild turkey, badger, and many other species that benefit from this. Here's a map that I threw together, including some of the prescribed burns we did this year. So management history from 1963 to 2021. And our first, if you can see my pointer on the screen here, the first burns were actually this little triangular piece here, and then this narrow piece here. Those were the sections that were burnt in 1963, just to give you an idea. And so you can see there's a few of the areas have received over 10 burn entries since prescribed burning started on the national forest. Mechanical treatment follows up burning, alongside timber harvest as a way to restoring areas that we need a little extra help in restoring the composition and structure of plants when shrubs are in a spot that fire hasn't had a good effect on. Usually fire is the first disturbance mechanism we're looking to use, but brushing does give us some strategic benefit in areas, and we look at roughly, since 2009, generally speaking, when Northwest Sands picked up, we're looking at 100 to 500 acres a year have been treated either by hand brushing or mechanical methods. But beyond the treatments, we also have monitoring. This is an adaptive process. We're always learning along the way, and part of that is monitoring. And so project monitoring is key for learning from what we've done and being strategic about how we approach it in the future. And since this is a team effort, there's been a lot of coordination between Bob and I, as well as other land managers in Bayfield County Forestry, other DNR biologists, other Forest Service biologists that have similar habitat, and many other partners that are looking at trying to really encourage and restore this Barrens habitat. And some of the monitoring that has happened, a lot of vegetation monitoring using the FireMon protocol, looking at the vegetation and fire effects as areas are restored, and the effects on burning on sapling regeneration, and when barren associate species start to come back to areas that were recently harvested and then prescribed burn. Other things are pollinators are of increasing interest. So we have pollinator contracts and in-house surveys that we're doing to give another take on restoration. And we learned that there's over 200 and plus species of moths that occupy the Moquah Barrens, and a lot of those species, really rely on Barrens habitats and are good indicators of whether you have a functioning and restored Barrens habitat. So by incorporating something like that to our overall monitoring allows us to have a better feel about, if the plants are coming back and then the moths are coming back, we're kind of going down the right path. Sharp-tailed grouse, songbird, we have a variety of bluebird boxes working with Northland College. We have an American kestrel nest box and productivity project, as well as winter tracking, and some other uncommon observations, such as the blanding turtle there in the lower left-hand corner. We have some observations of those species on the Barrens as well. Another component of monitoring is looking at the fire regime condition class. Fire being our primary disturbance mechanism, it's good to know how we're moving the needle. And the Northwest Sands project looked at where our desired future condition would be as it relates to the fire regime condition in our return intervals with fire. And on this graph here, at the time that Northwest Sands was signed, this blue marker here in the moderate departure from where we'd like to be with our fire regime shows where the plan was. And here, this yellow one is kind of our general estimated location of where we are now, and the Northwest Sands plan by 2024. This was our goal here, our desired future condition, to have a low departure from the historic fire regime. And we've been moving in that direction since 2009, and we're looking at updating our FRCC analysis this year based on some more extensive fire monitoring, and looking at understory species composition, overstory species composition, tree structure, shrub density, and the fire regime all kind of funnel into this. So it's not just the on the ground work for like the physical restoration work, but it's this monitoring that's really key in helping us guide our efforts. And of course, it takes a lot of funding, and funding comes from not only appropriated funds, but also funds from the timber harvests that have been going on associated with the restoration activities, but also the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative through the EPA, Lake Superior Landscape Restoration Partnerships, and also other partners and grants and funding opportunities such as the National Wild Turkey Federation and funds from the turkey stamp of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources have really helped with our efforts out on the Moquah Barrens. And of course, it takes an entire team to do this work. And here's just a list of some of the partners that have been really instrumental in these last handful of years, well, more than a handful of years, decades of work on the Barrens. And it couldn't be done without these folks and the individuals involved with these agencies and organizations. And just to bring it home here, today on the Moquah Barrens, a lot has been going on, as you can already see from the previous slides, but you know, we've been working with the Lake States Fire Science Consortium and Joint Fire Science Program to provide learning opportunities through the Barrens. And you know, the soil heating, there's been a soil heating and severity study through the Northern Research Station with the Forest Service that looking at the extensive prescribed burning we've done on the Barrens, and then leveraging looking at the soil heating and effects of, you know, hardwood regeneration, availability and viability of the seed bank, and then what those intermediate and long-term availability of nutrients are. You know, like, so having that information about how the fire's playing this role on the landscape and that finer scale has really helped things along. I've already mentioned the pollinator contracts and brush treatments, but then, you know, this overall landscape, like what we're doing here in Moquah can apply to that larger landscape. So working with Bob Hanson and others have really been instrumental, but it's not just about the vegetation. You know, sharp-tailed grouse is a really good example of one of those species that when I think of Barrens in Wisconsin, sharp-tailed grouse come to mind. And in 2016 and 2018, the Forest Service, along with the DNR and other partners, worked on this translocation project to give the local population at the Moquah Barrens a boost, but also with the hopes of having these birds, you know, spread out onto the landscape. You know, and if you can think back to Bob's presentation and where those stepping stones are, you know, that's what we're hoping, that these birds would help to benefit those other populations and give them a genetic boost. And through that 3-year time period, we were able to bring 160 sharp-tailed grouse onto the Moquah Barrens, 66 females and 94 males. And of those, 35 of those birds were fitted with VHF transmitters. About 21% of the overall birds were fitted with transmitters. Same thing proportionally with each sex, 15 females and 20 males, to kind of take a look at, you know, if we could find nests and look at productivity, but also what are the differences in habitat use between sexes, and where are these birds in general utilizing the habitats. You know, through these efforts, we have learned a lot. And I think, you know, these birds surprised us in where they moved. And also they were, I believe, from based on where they moved, you know, already contributing to the overall genetic diversity, or helping to influence it a little bit, you know, as they moved across the landscape, as I'll show in the next the slides here, looking at the radio telemetry project. And if you can think back to where the general outline of the Northwest Sands landscape was, the Moquah Barrens is right here. That's where all the birds were released. And the yellow circles I'm going to pop up on the screen are where we saw the birds disperse to. So we had birds dispersing over 5 miles, you know, from the Barrens to the west, and even farther than 5 miles, you know, to over to Cloverland and Maple. And there's even a bird observed over in Park Point and Duluth. We had birds to the east, also birds heading to the southwest towards Namaquogan Barrens, where a bird was harvested and bands recovered. So that's a 50-mile straight line flight, which, as you can see in this map, we have the Barrens and habitats pointed out along the line here. If you can think back again to that map that Bob shared of the landscape and those key areas and stepping stones, the birds likely followed those paths. So this information from our radio telemetry project really kind of leads a lot and lends a lot to that argument Bob was making about the need for connecting these habitats. Looking a little closer, one of our males made some movements to the west of the Moquah Barrens and really showed us where some of these key locations were. And so interestingly enough, these birds were utilizing areas that had historic dancing grounds at. So, you know, we were finding that they weren't as disconnected from some of these areas as we originally thought, and that birds are finding and picking up on key habitat characteristics that might not be outrightly obvious to us, but gives us a direction where to look. Looking at the Moquah Barrens as a whole, and all of the birds here, we estimated home range sizes and where the key areas were. And if on this map, you can see these are all different, locations used by either aerial flight or Yagi antenna. And looking at estimated home range size really shows that the birds are using these open and restored parts of the Moquah Barrens. And the areas shaded here are where they spent, represent areas that contain 50% of all of the observations of sharp-tailed grouse during this period of time. And 3 of these areas are historic dancing grounds. And one other area here is where we detected a lot of activity during winter tracking surveys. And so, a lot's been going on, but a lot continues. A landscape approach to management takes a lot. It's just not a one solution kind of deal. It's continually learning and working with partners. And, on the Forest Service, in the Moquah Barrens, we're going to continue to implement the Northwest Sands Restoration Project. We're looking at, where we can do complementary barrens management in adjacent large vegetation projects, like the recent Greenwood project that just kicked off on the Washburn Ranger District. We have large clear cuts that we're doing adjacent to the Moquah Barrens core area to provide large temporary openings over time to even connect the core with some of those satellite barrens I pointed out in an earlier map. We're looking at the effects on vegetation and wildlife, looking at that seasonality and frequency of burning, non-native invasive species control, pollinator work, sharp-tailed grouse, as I mentioned, but then continuing to collaborate with partners is key. And so looking at interagency prescribed burning, next year, we're hoping to do a prescribed burn on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Iron River Fish Hatchery, which is just to the west and adjacent of the Moquah Barrens, to help them bring back fire to some of those remnant barrens habitats that they have on that property. Using some of the feathers that we collected during our translocation in a partnership with UW-Madison Polylab, Wisconsin Sharp-tailed Grouse Society, and the DNR, we're trying to build up a more robust genetic database of sorts that we can start to look at genetic connectivity of our birds, not only here, but also across the state. And then also, I just would like to end with a note on the Bayfield County Sharp-tailed Grouse Habitat Use Project, which builds on all the work that's been going on in the county. And this is a partnership with kicked off by Bayfield County Forestry, but also includes the Natural Resources Research Institute out of Duluth, the Wisconsin DNR, and the Forest Service. And that kicked off this spring. And here's just a couple maps that got pulled. We're using GPS trackers, as you can see, affixed as backpacks on the birds here. And the maps that you see here in the upper right, lower middle, and lower left are all male birds. And it gives you a fix. It gives you a little finer scale detail than just the VHF transmitters to hopefully lead us to a better understanding of what habitat components these birds are using during all stages of their life history throughout the year. Hopefully get 2 to 3 years out of data out of these birds. And these fixes are being followed up with vegetation assessments by NRRI. And the map here on the upper left are some fixes from the one hen that was detected, and hopefully will give us an idea of what hens we're using over time. Unfortunately, this hen has been predated, so our data set has been cut short. But the little bit of data points that we got from her should lead us into, at least for that dancing ground area, to some idea of what she was selecting for habitat. So with that, I know that was a quick whirlwind tour of the Moquah Barrens and all that goes on, but hopefully it kind of gave you a flavor of, all the pieces that are involved with trying to restore this important imperiled ecosystem, and all the partnerships that are involved in continuing to develop and get stronger throughout this work. So I guess I hope there's a little bit of time, maybe 10 or 12 minutes for questions, so I can stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Jen or whoever's moderating that part. So thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Brian and Bob. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time, and it's very interesting and just goes to show what partnerships can do. So with that, I'm going to open this up to a little bit of a Q&A. If anybody has questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand or type your message into the chat box. Just got to pull up my participant menu. And I don't see anybody currently with a raised hand. You can also blurt something out if nobody's talking. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask a question. So we talk a lot about these temporary habitats and jack pine stands that have been removed in order to create these temporary dancing grounds for sharp-tailed grouse. How long do those temporary dancing grouses last? And how long do we know how long they're at their kind of peak performance as far as birds utilizing it?
I can maybe take this one, Brian.
Sure.
Yeah, we're figuring they're going to last about 12 years, and we've seen that on historic fire sites, and also where we've done our harvesting as well, especially from the budworm outbreaks from the late 80s and early 90s. Typically what we would do is you do the harvest, but we also do some type of a scarification to help disturb the soil so we have better seed contact, not only for jack pine, but also for the Barrens plants to come back as well. So I think that actually helps because we're trying to mimic, the effects of a large kind of epic natural wildfire. So, much more than what we can get on a prescribed burn as far as the effects. So we need to do a little more disturbance than just the timber harvest. That fits right into jack pine regeneration. Also fits right into what we're trying to do as far as getting that Barrens to respond and not just turn into hazel shrubs right away or scrub oak. So yeah, about 12 years, and we're seeing at the German Road fire still. It was in 2013. And it's still firing along really well. Some of the best flex we had were up in that area, and it's still coming along pretty well. And we're hoping to at least get 12 years out of that as well. And I think the peak would probably be, they moved into the fire the second year after it, and it kind of bounced around, but then it grew to those 4 leks probably within 4 years, and it's kind of been holding there for now.
Great, thank you, Bob.
Jenna, there's a few questions in the chat box there.
Yeah, thanks. I missed John Olson. So has anyone looked at the economic value of Barrens community directly to humans via bird tourism, berry picking, etc.?
I don't know if I've looked to see if there's anything specifically for Moquah Barrens, but I do know that it is listed as an important bird area, and it does bring in a lot of visitors. We have the Chequamegon Bay Birding and Nature Festival, typically outside the pandemic era, that brings in a lot of folks. But even outside of a special event like that, there's always people out there birding, berry picking, and doing other, hunting. So yeah, I believe that there is quite an economic value of having ecosystems like this. Bob, maybe you have a perspective from the larger landscape there.
No, specifically to like Crex Meadows and some of the other properties, there's been some studies done, and they did that study on Crex. But that, it's getting kind of dated by now. But yeah, definitely whenever there's something unique out in the landscape, with the internet, the word gets out and all some people show up. But I think they would be in our best interest to help quantify, how big of an impact that is. Because it's pretty easy when you sell your trees and they go down the road, you know how much you made. But when you have a wildlife area and people are coming and going and buying gas and groceries and eating out, it's hard to put a value on that for a community, and they need to know that. That's part of the reason why they're doing that auto tour as well, to bring more people to the area, partner with the businesses, and to be able to take that tour of the Northwest Sands, which incidentally follows the old Native American footpath that they used to use. And the reason why they used that footpath is because the Barrens were more open than the surrounding forest. So just that simple fact alone, that it was more open historically enough to have this mode of transportation is kind of a neat thing to kind of show folks.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And then this is another question for Brian. I spent a lot of time in the Moquah Barrens this time of year. I'm from Bad River and my people have been connected to this area for centuries. Wondering about the ridges of the hills. It looks like remnants from historic planting efforts, possibly.
Yeah, if you're referring to there's furrows throughout parts of the Barrens, as particularly if you're familiar with the area and you've driven up the paved Forest Road 236, or sometimes called the Ino Road, or along Forest Road 242, it's really evident. And if you're talking about those furrows or ridges there, that is definitely part of a planting effort from that Civilian Conservation Corps era, where they were looking at planting jack pine or red pine. And some of those areas just didn't do a good job, and so it was failed plantings, or through the restoration efforts, those trees were taken out and burned over. So yes, it does also paint, it's a remnant and shows the history of the area, but also shows how fragile these ecosystems can be, and some of these impacts that people have had on them over the years can be there and linger for a long time. So that does provide a little bit of complexity to the restoration effort too, because of those more fragile soils, I guess, if you want to say sandier, fragile soils. Jenna, there was a question that came direct to me, if you don't mind.
Sure,
I'll answer. Yeah, Kyle Anderson sent me a question here that was directed at how often do you burn open Barrens blocks? And that's a good question. So we have burnt over the years, at least as long as I've been on the district, they've ranged from a return of 4 years, which is a little quick, to as long as 6 years. And I'm hoping to extend that now to 6 to 8 years, because some of these open Barrens blocks are, what we would, I guess, consider a more restored state, and they can, go longer periods of time without return of fire, because we don't have the, shrub regeneration like some of the younger blocks that we're looking to move towards an open barren state. So that's important to kind of lengthen those return intervals with our fire, because that allows the vegetation structure to come back. There's a little bit of a lag time between when you treat a block of habitat to, the species leave the area, vegetation's burnt down, there's that lag time to let some of the plants, the seed bank, come back, butterflies to move back into there, and so on. So yeah, we're hoping to extend that return or between burns and those open blocks.
Do you do seasonal burns, spring, summer, and fall, or just during the spring?
Bob, you want to go first, since I
think more and more we're getting to the point where we're trying to burn whenever it makes sense, and then we can actually pull it off. So avoiding the nesting season, but yes, summer burns are definitely on the table if we get conditions. It's a little bit tricky to get those conditions, because you could have them and then just get one rainstorm and you lost them. But then definitely more fall burning going on nowadays. That's good to see, and we're trying to get every burn we can in the spring as well. So fire is our main tool, and it's our most efficient tool, so we're trying to utilize it as much as we can. And Brian, if you want to answer for Moquah.
Yeah, like one of the previous slides showed that early on spring burning was like the primary season, and there has been summer burns. So basically, looking at the end of July into August time period for burning in the past, but we've really made an effort over the last few years to at least move a portion of some of our burn units towards summer. And so this year, again, we have some of our burn blocks that will be, at the end of July, early August time period. And we're hoping every year to just keep building on that, because we do see a lot of positive effects of varying the seasonality. You have different effects on the wildlife species, as far as like avoiding the nesting period, like Bob just said, and other critical time periods. But then just the way that fire behaves on the landscape is so different between those seasons. And you get a lot of different and interesting effects on plant structure, in the summertime, for example, fire is a little more moderated, so you get a lot of more of a mosaic approach. A lot of areas don't burn completely, so you have some built-in refugia for some species. So there are a lot of benefits to varying that seasonality, and we're working towards that to get that that more natural mix of different season.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
I don't see any more questions in the chat. Does anybody have a question that they would like to raise their hand or speak up for? All right, I'm going to ask another one then. In a perfect world, if you could convert all of your temporary blocks into permanent blocks, would it help with assisting breeding habitat? I know that, you know, I visited an old lek that was about 10 feet in pines this year, and it was still being used. And I don't know if that increases predation or not, but it's interesting to see that they may be a little bit tied to leks, historical lek.
Yeah, and I don't know if I could put all of our temporary stuff into permanent barrens, you know, and maintain it through fire. I don't know if we could maintain it that way. I think eventually you would just not be able to physically do it or even economically do it. But I think it's a really important part of the tools in the tool chest to have. Prescribed fire is a great way to maintain some of the core areas, but then also through harvest, let the loggers do the work and let the counties and other landowners receive some economic value coming in from that to you know, use it for what the community needs it to be. But I think it's those two tools that we're utilizing here, prescribed fire and timber harvest and regeneration, is really key to actually be able to do something at this scale. I'd love to be able to bring some grazing in as well, to have another tool in the toolbox. But those are our two big tools we have right now, and keeping those markets strong for logging and for timber harvest are really important. And we can see that as we right now, it's not the best markets, and it's getting a little bit harder and more of an ask to sell pulp. And we'd love to see that pulp market come back, or something to use as those smaller conifer species.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Bob and Brian. We really appreciate it. It is 1 o'clock now, so I am going to close this session. But just a reminder, every second Wednesday of the month at noon, we put on these webinars, and we have quite a few entertaining ones coming up, so we hope to see you then. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Bob and Brian outside of this. And yeah, thanks again, Bob. Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye.